Women.
By Ilsa, Erica, Olivia, and Grace. Featuring Mr. Cohen, Mr. Nordmark, Emma Kemp, and Finnegan Redden.
During the 19th century and before, women in Europe held very few personal rights while men held power in all aspects of life. During the late 19th century, women and men lived very different lives. While men could vote and were able to hold well-paying jobs along with having various legal rights, women had no such rights and were often impoverished or economically dependent on their male family members. This caused the political uprisings we see through the suffragettes.
Late 19th century women led lives that reflected their social rank. Women had no voting rights whatsoever and very few opportunities to assert their economic and legal rights. They were virtually owned by their husbands. Generally speaking, whatever class women belonged to, they were almost always economically dependent on men, meaning their husbands or their fathers. Until the last quarter of the century, in most European countries, married women could not own property in their own names, no matter what their social class. Upon marriage, women lost to their husband's control any property they owned or that they might inherit by their own labor. Their legal identities were subsumed in their husbands' identities, and they had no independent standing before the law. Private property and wage earning were the basis of European society, so this put married women at a great disadvantage because it limited their freedom to work, to save, and to move from one location to another. By 1882, Great Britain had passed the Married Women's Property Act, which allowed women to own property in their own right. In France, however, married women could not even open a savings account in her own name until 1895, and married French women did not gain possession of the wages they earned until 1907. In 1900, Germany allowed women to take jobs without their husband's permission, but except for their wages, a German husband retained control of most of his wife's property. European family law also disadvantaged women. Legal codes such as the Napoleonic Code and remnants of the Roman law still in effect made women legal minors throughout Europe. In England before 1857, each divorce required a separate act of Parliament. Thereafter, couples could divorce with difficulty through the court of matrimonial causes. In Great Britain, adultery was the usual cause for divorce, but to obtain a divorce, a woman had to prove her husband's adultery plus other offenses, whereas a man only had to prove the wife's adultery. French law forbade divorce between 1816 and 1884. In Germany, only adultery or serious maltreatment were recognized as reasons for divorce. Divorce required hearings in court and the presentation of legal proof, making the process expensive and more difficult for women who did not control their own property. Men's extramarital sexual relations were tolerated to a much greater degree than those of women. Husbands exercised authority over the children. A husband could take children away from their mother, and only a father in most countries could permit his daughter to marry. He could force her to marry the man of his choice. Fathers received custody of children in divorce regardless of previous treatment. Sexual and reproductive rights of women could hardly be discussed in the 19th century. Contraception and abortion were both illegal, rape laws worked as a disadvantage to women, and men controlled the world officially and legally. Women had higher rates of illiteracy due to less education and inferior education to men's, and they were only educated enough for the domestic lives they were expected to lead. University and professional education remained reserved for men until at least the third quarter of the century. The University of Zurich first opened its doors to women in the 1860s, and women's colleges were founded at Cambridge. Education for women became much more progressive in Western Europe. In many countries, more foreign than native women attended university classes. Lack of secondary education prevented women from earning qualifications to move on to other universities, and men thought women would overcrowd their professions. School teaching at the elementary level became seen as a female job because of its association with the nurturing of children. It became seen as a professional haven for women, and teachers were educated but not at a university level. Some men in the educated elites feared the challenge educated women posed to traditional gender roles in the home and workplace, so they restricted women's access to post-secondary university education to help bar them from social and economic advance. Progressive women faced social obstacles, humiliation, and outright bigotry as they challenged the notion of separate spheres. Women themselves were often hesitant to support feminist causes as they were so thoroughly acculturated into the recently stereotyped roles.
New job opportunities opened up for women with the expansion of education and industrialization. Jobs like elementary school teachers, secretaries, clerks, and shop assistants were now available to women. These jobs nonetheless required low-level skills and remained occupied primarily by widowed or unmarried women. Women rarely occupied high-level jobs and still received much lower wages than men, making it virtually impossible for a woman to live independently without husband's or father's income. Upon marriage or childbirth, women withdrew from the workforce. Towards the end of the 19th century, employment opportunities in the textile and garment-making industry dropped, and employment favored young unmarried women more than ever. It was considered the less work a woman did outside the house, the more stable a household was. Many working-class women worked in the putting-out system, where material for clothing was put out to sweatshops or households, where women made the clothing. Their wages were considered as supplementing their husband's or father's wages, and were therefore subjected to major exploitation. Because so many women did not fit the stereotype of a wife or daughter supplementing the family income, every major European city had thousands of prostitutes who could find job in no other positions. Many prostitutes worked from their late teens to age 25, working in cities near naval bases or places with moving populations. Many women who worked in factories and not as prostitutes were still subject to sexual exploitation by factory managers and other men who gave them an opportunity to earn more money.
During this time period, many middle-class families were financially stable enough to demand the service of domestic servants. They also moved into new, fashionable houses in the ever-expanding suburbs. Just as they were many years prior, there were very clear distinctions between work and family that were defined by gender. The men worked and the women took care of the home. Married women generally became limited to the roles of wife and mother due to the fact that the media glorified motherhood and housework. Many men and women in this time period agreed with Rousseau in thinking that men and women operate in different spheres. Women were the direct unit of consumption within the family home, thus all advertising was geared toward them. The middle-class lifestyle heavily limited women's ability to do what they wished due to the fact that they were limited to housework. At this time, women were still considered property and were a symbol of a father or husband's success. Religious and charitable activities became a key part of the expected work of middle-class housewives. The strict relationship between religion and oppressive domestic life led to increased tension between feminism and religious authorities. Because women could not work outside of the home, they found a way to give back to the community through working with the church. This gave them an outlet to serve their community as well as themselves. Middle-class women were expected to carry out charitable domestic work within the church. They served to help the poor and also served as social workers within the church, private charities, and the government. Sexuality and family size. Recent studies have shown that average middle-class families in the late 19th and early 20th century enjoyed sexual relations within marriage much more than was previously thought. During this period, sexual enjoyment was favored over sexual repression and was very common in a middle-class household. Many women's uneasiness about sexuality stemmed from their fear of childbirth as well as the bad sanitation during this period. Nearing the end of the 19th century, small families were favored due to the fact that it allowed them to purchase luxury items. Desired small family sizes led to decreases in birth rates first in France and then in England by 1870. By the end of the 19th century, contraceptives were commonly used within the middle-class families to keep the small family sizes.
The rise of political feminism. Obstacles to achieving equality. Many women were reluctant to support feminist causes because conflicts arose between different women's values, which caused problems with the entire feminist movement. Roman Catholic feminists were uncomfortable with radical secularist feminists and did not believe in radicalism, and so did not support radical feminists, which caused a divide between the two groups. Mary Wollstonecraft, which we had seen in an earlier chapter, wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which brought the idea of feminist to the British people. Votes for women in Britain. Millicent Fawcett, who was one of the first feminists in Britain, led the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Her tactics were those of English liberals, because her husband, Henry Fawcett, was a Liberal Party cabinet minister. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies could rally almost 500,000 women in London to support the suffragette movement at that time. Parliament would grant women the vote if they proved they would be respectable and responsible in political activity. The next major feminist was Emmeline Pankhurst, and she led the Women's Social and Political Union, who called themselves the Suffragettes. They were radical British feminists who lobbied publicly and privately for the right to vote. They were violent, causing arson, breaking windows, and sabotaging postal packaging. There were many other feminists, such as Barbara Smith Bodichon, who was a leader in education and political rights, and she founded Girton College in Cambridge and gave her own time and money to support it. She also helped with the Married Women's Property Act. Many were in prison, such as Emmeline Pankhurst and Alice Paul, who are pictured here. They went on hunger strikes while in prison and were then force-fed. They marched en masse on Parliament to try and secure their right to vote. Suffragettes included not just middle-class women fighting, but lower-class women were fighting for better working conditions and wages so that their factory jobs had better hours and better conditions. In 1918, women finally received the right to vote. The influence of the British suffrage movement abroad. The British suffrage movement was most influential in the United States. The movement in the U.S. was led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, and they were the leaders of the National Woman's Party. They demanded full political rights instead of being peaceful and having a gradual expansion of rights. They were violent and were in prison and went on hunger strikes. Political feminism on the continent. Europe's women's movements were smaller than Britain's. In France, the feminist leader was Herbertine Auclet. She was pretty much alone in the fight for women's rights. Later, the French created the National Council of French Women, but the organization did not support the women's vote for several years. They rejected violence and thought fighting peacefully would be successful. The Chamber of Deputies passed a bill in 1919 granting the right of women to vote, but the Senate defeated it in 1922. The vote was not given to the French women till after World War II.
In Germany, feminist awareness and action faced great challenges. Louise Artaud had pioneered feminism in the 1840s, but then she had to stop because of backlash. There were many laws against women participating in political activities. Louise Artaud and August Schmidt and others later created the Union of German Women's Organization. They wanted the right to vote, but they also focused on improving women's social conditions, better education, and extending the right to other protections, and admittance to political or civic activity on the municipal level. The German Social Democratic Party supported women's suffrage, but authorities and the German Roman Catholics hated the socialists, so feminism was thought of as even more suspect than it already was. Women received the right to vote in 1919. Norway and Finland were the only two countries who allowed women to vote before World War I.
Women, for the first time in European history, began in significant ways to demand a political role and to protest the gender inequalities embedded in law and family life. Women began to enter professions and were taking a significant role in the service economy, such as the new telephone companies. These changes, as much as the demands of socialists, would in time raise questions about the adequacy of the much admired late 19th century middle class lifestyle.